Good afternoon, and welcome to the first installment of the Summer 2021 Virtual Book Talk series, sponsored by the Program in the History of the Book in American Culture here at the American Antiquarian Society. I'm happy to share that we've been conducting this series for over 1 year now, and I would like to express my gratitude for everyone who participated in these events and those who attended them. We come to you from the ancestral lands of the Nipmuc tribal community, a community that continues to thrive here in central Massachusetts. I'm Kevin Wisniewski, Director of Book History at AAS, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. With me is AAS Library Assistant Amanda Kondik. Before introducing today's guests, I would like to welcome everyone here today. And for newcomers here, I'd like to briefly introduce the Society. AAS was founded in 1812 by printer Isaiah Thomas. We are a research library and learned society located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're dedicated to understanding and sharing the history and culture of North America before the 20th century. As a library, we collect, preserve, and share the printed record of what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and graphic arts. In addition to this virtual book talk series, we have a variety of public programs. We offer visiting research fellowships. And prior to the pandemic, we welcome scholars and researchers from around the world to use our reading room to work on their own projects. Before I introduce today's guests, Amanda will offer a quick overview on the platform we're using today.
Thank you, Kevin, and welcome everyone. The chat function is open, so feel free to send your comments to all attendees and panelists. And throughout the presentation, I will also be posting additional information and links in the chat relating to our speaker, AAS, and FIBAC. And you should be able to save the chat by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat window. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me privately in the chat. For the Q&A portion of the program, we'll be using the Q&A function located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for Rachel and Laura during or after their presentation, please type them in there. And as attendees, you will also have the option to upvote your favorite questions by selecting the thumbs up icon. And we'll get to these questions at the end of our program. And finally, I would like to let everyone know that we are recording this program. So for those of you who cannot attend or for those who would like to rewatch it, we will be posting it on the AAS YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. And Kevin, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Amanda. Today's guests are Rachel Sagner Buurma and Laura Heffernan, and they will be sharing their latest book, The Teaching Archive, A New History for Literary Study, published by the University of Chicago Press. And I would like to mention quickly right now that the press has graciously shared a code with us for a 20% discount on book purchases. So please keep an eye out for that in the chat. Laura Heffernan is Associate Professor of English and Director of the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of North Florida in Jacksonville. At UNF, she is a project lead on the Viola Muse documentary edition, a digital edition of Muse's work for the Negro Writers Division of the Florida Federal Writers Project. In addition, Heffernan is writing a book right now on how writers taught modernist literature in the early 20th century, titled Unliterary Critics, to be published by Columbia University Press. Rachel Sagner Buurma is Associate Professor of English at Swarthmore College and co-director of the Aydelotte Foundation for the Liberal Arts. She teaches courses on 19th century literature and culture, the history of the novel, literary and informatics, and book history. She has recently published essays on book indexes, Anthony Trollope, and reading in the digital age. In addition to the Teaching Archive, together, Heffernan and Buurma's co-authored work has appeared in PMLA, New Literary History, Representations, Victorian Studies, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. So please join me in welcoming Rachel and Laura.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that lovely introduction. And thanks for inviting us. And thanks to Amanda and the other AAS staff for making our visit possible. We really appreciate it. And we're excited to be here. We're going to talk about our book for about half an hour to try to leave plenty of time for conversation and Q&A with the audience. Our book, The Teaching Archive, recovers the everyday teaching of literary scholars over the course of the 20th century in order to write a new history for the discipline of English studies. And we thought we needed a new history for the discipline of English studies because we were really dissatisfied with existing approaches to disciplinary history. And we think a lot of other people in our profession were especially dissatisfied with the ways that disciplinary historians of literature have tended to take a really selective, but even more kind of alarming, really distant view of our profession. So when people like Gerald Graffs in his Professing Literature or John Guillory in Cultural Capital talk about the discipline of literary study, they talk about it from a view that seems like from a mountaintop looking down on the tiny little ant-like literary critics going about their business, not from a perspective that seems invested, but even more from a perspective that seems like close to the everyday practices of literature professors. And to the extent that books like disciplinary histories like these do perform real research on the everyday life of our discipline's history, it tends to address and look at just self-conscious moments, methodological manifestos, speeches at the MLA, mission statements, and public method feuds. And then paying attention only to these kinds of high-level, public, very self-conscious conversations about literary study. These histories produce a sense of our past that emphasizes innovation and originality and rupture. And they come up with a version of literary history that emphasizes like big swings between historicist, scholarly errors on the one hand and formalist pedagogical errors on the other. And so for us, and we think for a lot of people, this produces a really alienating account of our profession, one that we can't connect to, and it doesn't like chime with our everyday practice and our everyday lives as literature professors. Especially the focus on method wars and manifestos doesn't really capture the everyday practices of the discipline and the day-to-day work of it. We also realized, and we realized this as we were kind of teaching the history of literary study to undergraduate students in large part, we realized that disciplinary histories ignored a very major part of our professional lives, our classroom teaching. When they do address classroom teaching, they tend to assume there's this kind of default that English professors in classrooms practice some form of close reading and have done so from 1940s when Cleanth Brooks invented it forward. And none of these really sort of address the actual classroom practice that we all know is very, very different from that description.
So what we tried to do in the book is essentially start over by searching out the archival traces of what and how professors actually taught in their 20th century classrooms. We tried to locate syllabi, lecture notes, quizzes, exams, examples of student work, student notes. And to do this, we enlisted the help of many librarians and archivists in the US and the UK who showed us where to look for many of these materials and helped us think about them in their institutional contexts. They also helped us locate these materials at a fuller range of institutions, including extension schools, women's colleges, state universities, community colleges, historically Black colleges and universities, and so on. As we gathered this material, it became more evident to us that despite the fact that students and teachers at such places are rarely included in disciplinary histories, these are the places where, in fact, most of the teaching of English has taken place. So most of the disciplinary practice has happened. What we'd like to do today is to give you a bit of an overview of the courses that we cover in the book's 7 chapters, which range from the early 20th century to the 1970s. We'll linger over a couple of courses that involve the teaching of American literature particularly. Over the course of its 7 chapters, the Teaching Archive makes several key arguments. We show how literature classrooms have generated major works of literary criticism and scholarship in our profession. We show how and why teaching cannot be separated from research in our field in practice, even as it becomes separated in budget lines and hiring practices. And we show how the English literary canon has in every decade been taught alongside a much wider array of texts that students and teachers often encounter as both literary and unliterary, or in transition between one and the other. We won't have time to make each of those arguments here for you today. Instead, we'd like to share with you some of the materials we worked with and show how we begin to move from these material texts to a reconstructed scene of teaching. We want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so we may think together about how we can and can't use documents to reanimate the collective and social work of the literature classroom. We do hope that this overview will highlight one of the book's major through lines, namely that the methods of book history and material text work have themselves been central to the teaching of literary studies during the entire 20th century at all kinds of institutions. Indeed, we found that perhaps even especially in classrooms at access-oriented institutions, teachers and students tended to focus not on the text itself or the quote poem on the page, but on questions of canon formation and the politics of literacy, questions of how authors came to read and to write, questions of how and why critics and students came to value their writing over decades and centuries.
So the book begins with a cluster of chapters on early 20th century UK classrooms, kind of starting where most conventional disciplinary histories tend to start. And we look, as you can see in the slide, at Carolyn Spurgeon's Art of Reading class that she taught at Bedford Women's College in 1913. What you see on the slide is the spines of her bound teaching notes, both notes from her own teaching and notes she took in some of her own classes with W.P. Kerr at Cambridge. In the book, we talk specifically about her Art of Reading class, in which she teaches her students how to read. It's for English majors already. And she says, well, you think you've come to college, you already know how to read, but I'm really going to teach you how to read. So she teaches them how to take notes on note cards and how to create personal indexes to works of literature like Ruskin's Unto This Last that are important to them. We also talk in the book about how her teaching relates to the quantitative study of Shakespeare's metaphors that she published. But most of all, and one of the reasons we began the book with her, is that Spurgeon has also been really important to us as a figure who valued teaching the way we wish the discipline of literary studies and higher ed institutions and even individual professors have been able to value teaching. And it's one of our ambitions of our work to try to make Spurgeon's vision of the profession a little bit more of a reality for more of us. In this early 20th century part of the book, we also turn to T.S. Eliot's 3-year modern English literature tutorial for working people that he offered during World War I through the University of London Extension School. You can see here a page from the printed, the University of London Extension School printed all of their syllabi. In the first 2 years of this tutorial course, Eliot and his students read through early and then later Victorian literature. And these syllabi, when we study them, show that the students had significant say over what the class covered. For example, in the second year, Eliot was moving on to later Victorian literature, and the students said, we demand Ralph Waldo Emerson first. And they stopped and spent 2 weeks on Emerson before resuming British literature. And so what you see here on the slide in particular is the class's 3rd year syllabus on Elizabethan literature. And as we show in greater detail in the book, this particular class on Elizabethan literature and the whole ethos of pedagogical experimentation of the Workers' Educational Association really shaped Eliot's volume of criticism, The Sacred Wood. Critics tend to think of The Sacred Wood as kind of setting the early 20th century canon for English literature classes, but really it was Eliot's working class students that set the stage and really contributed to The Sacred Wood. So we move on from the very early 20th century in the book to look at 2 1920s classrooms together. Here on the slide, you see a page of, so the first class is I.A. Richards's practical criticism courses, which he taught at Cambridge in the late 1920s. He published the book Practical Criticism in 1929. And literary critics often take this book, consider this book foundational to English pedagogy, and really take this book as a model for what Richards's and other teaching at that time was like, and see it as a model of really correcting student interpretations, wrong student interpretations of poems, and asserting that English professors should be the professionals teaching students how to read poems. But actually, if you look at Richards' teaching notebooks, you get a really different picture of the purpose and practice of the practical criticism classes as he actually taught them. Richards opens the first week of the class by getting up and saying, this class is an experiment and it might completely fail and we'll just have to like call it quits and call it a day and move on with our lives. So really different from the kind of like august Don getting up on the stage to like waggle his finger at students who can't interpret poetry. And we really see that when we only see that when we look at the teaching notes themselves. Our second 1920s experimental classroom is Edith Rickert's much less well-known scientific analysis of style class, which she taught at the University of Chicago during the same years that Richards was teaching practical criticism. Rickert did not leave behind any teaching notes, but she did write a book about her class titled New Methods for Literary Study, which heavily credited her students, like by name in the footnotes, for helping her devise new methods for creating different ways of quantifying and tabulating and visualizing aspects of literary style. Some of her students in some iterations of the New Methods class even went on to write their own book, A New Approach to Poetry, in which they described how Rickert's teaching, university level teaching, inspired them to create methods for involving school children in the visualization and analysis of literary texts. So here in the slide, you see the University of Chicago Press's ad for both books. In the next several chapters of our book, we follow a few critics around through the mid-century decades. As we mentioned in opening, disciplinary historians often think about the mid-century moment as dominated by new critical professors who charismatically teach students how to read poems on page, like no historicism, no context, no materiality. And to test this theory, we looked at a central chapter in Cleanth Brooks's modern poetry course at Yale in the 1960s. As you can see here, which is a page from the full transcript of Brooks's poetry class, Brooks had contracted with Bantam Books to turn his lectures into a published volume. So this was this unique case in all of our archival work in which you could actually see a full transcript of what Brooks was doing during the ups and downs of the classroom hour. And as a contrast with Brooks's modern poetry course, we've also looked at courses on Dickens, Joyce, and literary language that Edmund Wilson was teaching as a visiting professor at places like the University of Michigan Summer School in these decades. Here is Wilson's quiz on Joyce that he gave to undergraduate students at Smith College in the early 1940s.
As part of our attempt to kind of expand the number of classrooms that we think of when we think of this mid-century moment beyond the kind of typical new critical formalist classroom that Rachel mentioned, we went to go look at the teaching papers that belong to Saunders Redding. So, these were papers related to a number of courses that Redding was teaching in the decades through mid-century: American literature, the Negro in American literature, American biographical literature. And Redding is teaching at HBCUs in the South in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. He's teaching primarily at Hampton Institute in the 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. Later on in the 60s, he moves to GW University to teach in their nascent American Studies program. And soon after, he's hired by Cornell University, where he becomes the first tenured African-American professor of literature in the Ivy League in 1971. So 71 at Cornell is an important moment. This is the moment when, northern universities that had been segregated begin to integrate their student bodies, and also it's the formation of Black Studies programs. When we looked at Redding's archive, we were really astonished at the number of invitations that he had received to become a visiting lecturer at countless northern colleges and universities around this time. And we also think of this moment in the 70s at Cornell as a moment then when the canon, quote unquote, begins to open. And you can kind of see in the course offerings at Cornell in 71, the mode that happens in. So, you get courses that have pre-existed that moment, courses like the novel or the political novel or the modern novel. And you see those professors, those white professors, begin to add African-American authors to those pre-existing reading lists. And That's very different, we found, from the model of American literature and integrated American literature that Redding had been teaching for decades by this point, and different from the model that he carries to Cornell. So here, for example, is the description for English 411 American literature from the Hampton Bulletin in May of 1941. It is a survey of American prose and poetry that begins with the most important present-day Negro writers and then circles back to the, quote, most effective writers of the colonial period. It approaches literature in such a way as to give the student an appreciation of the fullness of life in the United States, together with sufficient historical and biographical material to meet the needs of prospective teachers and to place writers in their proper perspective. Considerable time and emphasis are given to the contributions of Negro writers, and these are treated as an integral part of American literature. Redding insisted in his published work, such as his famous 1939 volume, To Make a Poet Black, that literature, and especially American literature, was as more important for its historical and political functions as for its aesthetic ones. He argued that, quote, until relatively recent times, writing by both Black and white Americans had little to do with pure literature and aesthetics, either as philosophy or in practice. And you can kind of hear him there talking back to the new critics, talking back to somebody like Cleanth Brooks, who's valuing literature for its literary qualities, its pure aesthetic qualities. This is his exam for the 1971 Negro and American Literature course that he taught at Cornell. He reminded students here, as he had since the 1940s in almost identical language, that, quote, writing by Black Americans is American writing, in fact, and that it cannot be lopped off from the main body of American literary expression without doing grave harm to both Black and white writing as a corpus of American experience, which corpus can be and should be seen as an instrument of historical and social diagnosis. So we regarded that big arc where Redding and his colleagues at Hampton are teaching an integrated American literature course reading list in the 30s and 40s that is really exactly kind of half white and half Black authors, and how Redding and other people are carrying that model north in the early 70s. But we also saw that that Redding tended to teach historical materials, speeches, documents, as well as literature in really all of his courses. When, for example, we looked at his course on the novel that he's teaching at Hampton in 1954, and here he's teaching Dickens and Dickens's David Copperfield, and we can see the exact same historicist and materialist approaches. Redding begins the couple of classes that he spends on David Copperfield by lecturing about Dickens's biography. And his approach to Dickens's biography is really to describe his childhood circumstances, and also the particulars of what he's reading and how he's getting access to those materials for his fiction and for the context of his writing. So it's very detailed outline about what exactly magazines he's getting his hands on, and then what classic texts he's not reading, he doesn't have access to. And what you can see in this slide is his notes for David Copperfield. He's taped in a passage from John Forster's biography of Dickens onto the page so that he can ask his students to consider to what extent David Copperfield is autobiographical and how these life experiences of Dickens make their way into Dickens's fiction, and what happens as those real experiences become repurposed and transmuted into a literary text.
In the book's second to last chapter, we turn to Josephine Miles, who taught courses in both close and distant reading at Berkeley, or what we now call distant reading, quantitative methods for literary study, from the 1930s through the 1970s. Here you can see the slide of her English 1A book list. She taught composition at Berkeley for like 40 years. Here's the book list she jotted down for her students in 1A. It includes the novel Mrs. Dalloway, a modern classic of their choice, but also a variety of more ephemeral print materials, including the current issues of Story Magazine and The New Yorker, and a bestseller. She writes next to bestseller, check scrap list, And actually, we thought this was a really great moment at in an AAS talk to ask if anybody who's a publishing historian in the audience knows what scrap lists are. Maybe they're like remaindered copies of bestsellers she's suggesting her students get. We're not sure. So I'd be grateful if anyone knows the answer to that. In our final chapter, we look at the very early surveys of Native American literature that the Acomo Pueblo scholar, poet, and activist Simon J. Ortiz designed and taught at the Community College of Marin in the 1970s. Much like Redding, Ortiz would come to find the survey course with its chronological ordering and reliance on nation-building narratives really unsuitable for teaching Indigenous literature for a number of obvious and less obvious reasons. In his classes at Marin, Ortiz grappled with the problem, as he was in his published writing, he grappled with the problem of how to teach the history of Native American literature. He was teaching this survey of Native American literature in the Ethnic Studies Department of Marin as Ethnic Studies 11, Native American Art, but it was really a literature survey, as he explained on the first day. Here you can see in our next slide, you can see an image from the journals that he kept in the 70s with him thinking through the idea that, quote, you could have an introduction to Native American literature and ventriloquizing the voices of other interlocutors of his who are kind of thinking about the importance or possibility of a survey of Native American literature, but also the seeming impossibility of it. Other professors were beginning to teach this class at the time. In Ortiz's archive, we saw that he collected examples of surveys of or intros to Native American lit, which tended to be taught as a traditional chronological survey, beginning with ethno-linguistic translations and reconstructions of stories that stand in for a kind of pre-contact oral tradition, though they're obviously quite mediated. And then these surveys would move through anthropologist mediated as told to autobiographies from the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. And then they'd end with contemporary writers of the early Native American Renaissance. And this was, in fact, the way Ortiz first taught the class during his first year at Marin, from a past kind of cast as oral to a present cast as written and written in English, from older texts to contemporary anthologies and collections in which literary texts illustrate a history of progress. But Ortiz must have been unsatisfied with this model, because in the second year of the class, he retained most of the texts he had selected, but upended when they were assigned almost completely. And you can see here, I hope you can see in our slide, the first iteration of the class in 1977 and the second iteration in 1978. You can kind of see the changes I'm about to describe yourself. So instead of the chronological model of 1977, in the revised class, Ortiz assigned 3 readings in most weeks. One from a kind of pre-contact representation of a pre-contact story, one from a post-contact, post-colonization autobiographical text, and one from a work of contemporary literature, sometimes from his own poetry, which was becoming very important in the late 70s. This model, he thought, was better suited to representing contemporary literature by Native authors as linked to, but not determined by, a literary past. It was also better, we think, he thought, suited to representing the particular history of Indigenous literature as neither validating the past nor as linked to or determining an already delineated future. And it was a better approach, we can assume, from reading some of Ortiz's other writings about his teaching elsewhere, his teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts. It was a better way to introduce students to a literature, Native American literature, that drew together texts from radically different nations and tribes and really shouldn't be represented as a unifying literature of a single national tradition, the way the survey kind of defaults to.
So that's a rough overview of all 7 chapters of the book. And looking at all of these archives together gives us a really new view of several things in the discipline. It gives us a pretty different history of methodological practice, moving away from that sort of contrapuntal historicist to formalist and so on. You can instead kind of see much longer continuities that subsist those big agonistic battles. You also get a really different picture of where methodological innovation is coming from. So it's very striking to look at Redding's archive and to see that he's practicing American studies, fully 25 years before the American Studies program is inaugurated at GW University. a really different view of who has made our discipline, those teachers and those students who have innovated in terms of method and canon. It gives us a really different view of the canon, of what's been taught in classrooms. Yes, canonical texts that you expect. Eliot is teaching Shakespeare, and Spurgeon is teaching Ruskin. Josephine Miles is teaching Virginia Woolf. But all of these people are also teaching this much longer tail of texts and authors that we don't really think of when we think of past classrooms. And the book ends in the 1970s with the Ortiz chapter. And that is really a decade that literary critics think of as a decade of methodological revolution. So they tend to think of the 70s as a moment, they either celebrate it as kind of a moment when the canon is quote unquote opened, or there are many critics who view this as a moment of crisis for the discipline after a mid-century of kind of big English unified purpose. A decade in which we see kind of incoherence around our texts or around our methods and our objects. So suddenly it seems like we're reading kind of any old thing. As we hope we've shown here, once you look at all kinds of classrooms and across the entire 20th century, you begin to see that this idea, that students and teachers have read a wider array of literary texts and documents throughout the century, and they've really taken an interest in the material questions of how these texts were written, published, circulated, and valued. The Teaching Archives history allows us to give up the idea that quote unquote traditional English was confronted in the 1970s with what Gerald Graff called the quote disruptive novelties of Black studies, feminism, and Marxism. But to recover the ways that our discipline has been hospitable to these texts and modes of thought is not to claim that universities throughout the 20th century welcomed the teachers and students who incubated them, nor is it to suggest that universities today have overcome the problems of access and equity that student movements shed light on in the 1960s and 70s. Yet making our histories more reflective of who has actually made the discipline is one way forward. The 1970s, where the book ends, is also the beginning of financial crisis for higher education that we're currently facing today. And the question of how to read this book on the importance of teaching and the interrelation of teaching and research in literary studies in this era in which teaching has become utterly devalued and really prized apart from research by the creation of adjunctified positions in higher ed is one that we do address in our conclusion to the book, and we'd be happy to talk more about in Q&A today. And I think that's pretty much all we have. Rachel, do you have anything else to add?
No, that's a great summing up.
Thank you. Thank you, slide. And I'm going to stop screen sharing so that we can have some Q&A.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks to both of you. While we wait for some questions to be entered into the Q&A, we have two there already. I kind of wanted to get things started. First off, I just wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the book, and I really admire it because of the way in which it really centers the work of teaching and makes that much more visible. And my overall experience the last 15 years in higher education has been that when I typically ask someone about their work, higher ed instructors, in particular, they often share this elevator pitch or anecdote about their latest project, about their scholarship, etc. And more often than not, it often feels like the teaching and research are very separate, distinct things. And I think the book and the whole, part of the argument of the book is that that these two realms come together, right? And I think the book really asks very important questions about the history of the discipline, the development of literary studies, and also who participates in its development. I wanted to kind of start with a very broad question to get things started. Because I'm sure that when you kind of went fishing for all of these various through these various archives, you found a whole bunch of different instructors that you could have pulled from as case studies. My first question is, how did you really, pick, the 9 or 10 that you picked for these 7 chapters? What was the strategy there?
That's a great question. And that's actually a similar question to the third question that I see over here in the chat from Dayton Haskin about asking about the through line of the book, which starts in the UK in the early chapters and then moves to the US through mid-century. And that is a trajectory that is well trodden by disciplinary histories that tend to kind of begin in the UK in the early 20th century and then move to the US at mid-century. So in part, we chose figures that allowed us to retread that same ground and really see things differently. But we also, a lot of things depended on the quality of the archive. And so there were many archives that we visited that had really interesting materials, but if they couldn't give us a good sense of what a class had been like, a particular class, then we sort of left them by the wayside for now, at least. I mean, they ended up being part of kind of our they were very much in our minds when we wrote the entire book, but we left them out as kind of concrete examples. So for example, like Josephine Miles, who is a Mexican American playwright who's teaching drama at Western Carolina College in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, has an amazing archive, but nothing really centered on a particular class. So we couldn't quite, pull that one together. So that was part of it. I mean, the other thing I would just say is that we're looking in many cases here at major figures in our field, foundational figures like T.S. Eliot, Edith Rickert, Cleanth Brooks. And it was very important to us to go back to those figures who we've all seen in a very certain way and to see them again as teachers and to ask what difference that made. And in many cases, it made a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, we were also looking for some kind of range of different types of institution, and that was very important too. So we were following the teaching, like T.S. Eliot sort of led us to University of London Extension School, and that was great because we could focus on Eliot, but also really show, as our research unfolded, how the University of London Extension School students like transformed and really shaped what we tend to think of as like Eliot's canon reformation, So that was really, really funny. I mean, we knew we wanted to kind of look at a community college and we were really interested too in maybe a tribal college or some kind of predominantly Native student serving college. We talked to a lot of tribal college librarians and looked in a lot of places and in Native student serving institutions before we kind of led to Ortiz and to the archive at Arizona that could support that kind of research. So partly it also relates to the question from Lauren Hilton, I see that we will answer down the road.
I love all those anecdotes of the book as well. I mean, you mentioned it in broad terms in your response, but watching some of these figures evolve as instructors. So, T.S. Eliot, you've given a couple of examples, very quickly today, but, the idea that, how he began in his first 2 years as an instructor, like many of us, right? He just kind of packed as much as he could into into a semester. And then, as he got comfortable in years 2 and 3 and 4, he's listening and responding to his students. He slows down the pace of things. He, eventually, right, completely changes his entire approach, really. So it's really a fascinating, set of stories. One other kind of follow-up to that response, though, you had mentioned the importance of including somebody from a community college. I am, because of my role at AAS, thinking about institutional archives and special collections in a way that I never have before. And I'm wondering, how difficult was it to go through or find the materials that you were essentially hoping to find at a smaller institution like a community college? And, especially now, increasingly, we're as professionals, our roles are quadrupling exponentially. Funds are decreasing, and the amount of space, the amount of funding that goes into just maintaining and adding archives like this, especially at smaller institutions, becomes increasingly problematic and difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's some examples that I won't name specifically of archives because they're not to do with the people who used to be or who were at these institutions or archives, but like there's some enraging examples of really amazing teaching archives at places that just can't be accessed because those institutions just don't have the funding that they need to have one librarian. Like they have archives that were funded at some point, but they don't right now because of national defunding. So that's a real thing. It did a lot of things like Ortiz's Marin College papers aren't at Marin College. They're in his archives at the Labriola Center. So that's another example. This is true for J. Saunders Redding's papers too. We spent some time, and Hampton has great archives and great archivists, and they had some of his materials, and they helped us a lot, especially with the course catalogs for the earlier years, the 30s and 40s and 50s at Hampton. But Redding's papers were all mostly at Brown.
We also, I mean, the one thing that Rachel mentioned is sort of one archive leading you to another sort of thing. And I mean, Redding's archive is a good example of this, but this happened multiple times that teachers borrow teaching materials from other teachers. So you'll often find things related to a different institution kind of in a well-funded institution's archive. So that was another kind of way around, that particular problem, I would say.
And some of it is just what's similar. If people work on publishers' archives, it's similar. Institutions change so much over time, and they're acquired, and they split, and they're absorbed. So, Spurgeon's Bedford College papers are, Laura, I'm blanking on where they are now. They're at Royal Holloway because Bedford sort of became a part of Royal Holloway.
Yeah.
Fascinating. I'm actually going to try to combine another question that I had with one that was posted in the Q&A here from Melissa Homestead. My question was really about the ways in which institutions or institutional or departmental policies also impacted teachers' approaches. Melissa actually writes here something a little bit different, but along the same lines. How did departmental structures impinge on this teaching? For example, in the early 20th century, Smith College had two English departments, one covering rhetoric and criticism, the other focusing on literary history and philology.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of. So we actually went and looked at Smith College, Melissa, but we were looking at Elizabeth Drew's papers. So it was a little bit later, I think, after the consolidation of those two things. I'll say that split, between that's a well-narrated split, a kind of 19th century split between rhetoric and criticism, which is seen as kind of engaging, charismatic, public-facing, men of letters headed version of English, and the literary history and philology wing, which is seen as scholarly and dry, and people, professors who drone on and lack any kind of charisma or connection to their students. And one of the things that we try hard to do in the introduction of the book is argue that split's been really overstated. It's dominated kind of our disciplinary imaginary of the 19th century, and it's really become a trope for how we think about the discipline as riven, as split between these two imperatives to kind of teach literature in an engaging way and to study literature and make knowledge about it in its historical context. But what we found in extension school classrooms, like when Spurgeon is teaching, not at Bedford, but at University of London Extension School, and that was one of dozens and dozens of examples of these kinds of classrooms. We saw that, classes with beginning students, with adult students, classes in colleges that didn't have a sort of stepped curriculum, that they were doing historical research, historicist research. They were working with old manuscripts at the British Library. They were doing all kinds of work that we would tend to think of as kind of dry, scholarly, maybe fodder for a grad seminar. But you see them teaching beginning students with that. So we try to really undo that split, which has, generated this mythology that historicist scholars kind of can't teach or something like that. So we show there's a lot of overlap kind of between the undergraduate classroom as this charismatic space and the practice of literary history and material text work and book history. To the question of departmental structures, Rachel, you might have a more ready-to-hand example about this. I mean, definitely the department structures make a huge difference. I mean, the fact that Ortiz is teaching in an ethnic studies program is, really changes kind of what courses are offered and his approach to those courses. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And that in some places, I mean, I think when Momaday is starting Native American studies at Berkeley, it's related to English, right? And ethnic studies is also starting up at Berkeley. I might be getting this wrong. Ortiz is teaching in ethnic studies at Marin. And actually, we don't even know what the Marin English department looked like at that moment, do we? But I mean, I go back to the beginning of the century too, and point out that at Bedford College, where Caroline Spurgeon was made a professor and the head of the literature department, right, Laura? The Bedford was just splitting in the teens and 20s as Bedford grew and had more and more like women students who were going to go on into professions. They opened the English literature side to match, or they divided the department into literature and language. But Spurgeon, who you'd really think of as a kind of historicist, philologist type, was the head of the literature department. So like that is just kind of like a structural example of how the mappings that Laura's, that seem so central to disciplinary history just don't always work in practice.
And I'll also say like that split between rhetoric and composition, literature as literature, historicist approaches to literature, and then creative writing, what we think of as creative writing. All of those were incredibly scrambled for everybody we looked at pretty much up until 1965. I mean, everybody we looked at essentially. Yeah. So Miles is teaching verse composition and freshman composition, but she's also teaching graduate courses on the lyric. I mean, if you think about this, like this is still true for most of us who have the kinds of jobs where you're teaching gen ed and composition courses in addition to teaching maybe like an MA seminar in your field. And I think we haven't yet built intellectual genealogies and histories of ideas that really account for like how much kind of utility infielding everybody is doing at their different institutions.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at Josephine Miles' archive, if you need to get excited again about like teaching composition or to look at someone who, as Laura said, really undoes the idea that in English departments, there are sometimes creative writers and they're comp people and they're criticism people. Like she's this remarkable synthesis of all three of those. And it all comes together at the level of the sentence for her. She has this full account that we give in the book of how at the level of the sentence, you're thinking about like data, you're thinking about composition, you're thinking about poetry composition and prose composition, and you're thinking, of course, about rhetoric.
Yeah, and I'd also just say like Redding, for example, he's arguing against a very formalist version of the aesthetic and of literature, but he's also teaching Brooks and Warren in his first year seminar. Right. So there is this thing that we could look at and say, this feels like incoherence to us, but again, we contend in the book that this is actually really reflective of how people experience the discipline, where these things that we think of as really riven and opposed, we actually have no problem kind of mediating across in our day-to-day lives, like literally our day-to-day lives, like our morning class, our afternoon class, and so on. And the question to begin asking is not like, how and why are these things so different? But how does doing this thing change how you do this thing over here? Like, what are the connections that we haven't really been able to see?
And that's why the material text approaches that we both sort of started our own and continued our own like graduate training with and using both of our research was so revelatory when we realized you could use it to think about the history of the discipline, right? Because the history of the discipline has not really thought beyond Cleanth Brooks's understanding poetry, like, okay, like you just imagine what's in that book and take that as what J. Saunders Redding is teaching. And that's just not, that's ridiculous. Like, it's completely obvious that J. Saunders Redding is not, using a literal version of a page by page reading of Brooks's Understanding Poetry. And neither is like literally anyone else in the world, including Cleanth Brooks.
That's Rachel's book history tirade.
I just wanted to add one quick thing for those interested in computational methods and DH work as well. There's a great passage in there on Josephine Miles on distant reading. And I read that chapter a couple of times. It's really insightful for me. So it was a whole new world that was opened up. I do want to get to a couple more questions here while time gets limited, I'm afraid. The next question here is from Laura Helton, and she asks, has your research, which relies heavily on archived syllabi and teaching notes, shifted your sense of what comprises the literary archive, in quotes? At least until fairly recently, archives acquiring writers' papers often devalued, quote, teaching materials as compared to manuscripts and correspondence and the like. Your book argues, it seems, for thinking differently about those materials in literary collections.
Yeah, I mean, we hope so. And I will say, the archivists that we talked to, I completely understand Laura's question here. And I also add that the archivists that we worked with were by and large really excited about teaching materials and kind of knew where they were and how to find them. But they were often archived and cataloged as a byproduct of either literary production or scholarly production. Sometimes even just because they were on the flip side of a page of an article draft. But I think, going back to that answer that we just gave about the connectedness of certain things, in a few of these chapters, it was really clear to us, and we don't get into this a lot in the book, but that teaching materials are absolutely part of the history of creative literary production in the 20th century. This is really true of Redding, who is, after he writes To Make a Poet Black in 1939, he's going on to write, in an array of genres. He writes a campus novel, he writes a historical book, he writes a kind of grant-funded documentary about his road trip around the South in 1942. And all of those works that he's writing are really thinking through questions of representation, sort of how writers make selection from reality, what they choose to represent, how they transmute it. And those are exactly the questions that he's taking up in his classrooms kind of over and over again. And we really had to go read the fiction and the history and the nonfiction to make sense of the teaching materials, and then, kind of vice versa. So, we would love it if we could all make that argument strongly enough that teaching materials became part of the acquisitions process. But you're absolutely right that they're certainly not, at this moment.
Yeah, and that's just, that's not primarily, as you know, Laura Helton, individual decisions by archivists or librarians, but it's like acquisition, decisions that are made and decisions that are made about what to keep and what to throw away. It was interesting, the places where teaching papers were carefully cataloged, and the Caroline Spurgeon, you saw in the beginning how carefully, how much she valued her teaching notes and how carefully she bound them. And at Royal Holloway, the archivist there, Annabelle Valentine, showed us the online, their paper finding aid, but also their online finding aid, which is meticulous and complete. And there is no record. Annabelle did not do this finding aid. It was from before her time. There's no record of who created that finding aid, which is incredible because it is a deeply, deeply detailed, caring artifact of professional work. And it's not a convention to author those, but it's also really kind of sad that we couldn't track down who had created that finding aid, because we could have learned a lot.
I want to conclude this talk with a couple of questions that were actually submitted in the chat. But before I do, at the beginning of the talk, you had mentioned your conclusion. And so I want to wrap things up in some way by talking about the future of teaching archives, because so much has changed since where you leave off in the 1970s. And you do mention a little bit online teaching, for-profit colleges in the conclusion, and all of these different scenarios that have popped up in the last 2 or 3 decades. Especially, I'm thinking of just in terms of, from the digital perspective. I think we all are still required to submit syllabi to some chair or dean or someone, and of course that's all done digitally now. I'm not quite sure where they ultimately end up, but what is the future of teaching archives? What does that look like? What kinds of documents or materials can we expect to be included in that? What problems and pitfalls might we run into if we were to write a chapter after where you leave off?
So I think the dark side is, that the more platformized, I can do the dark side and Laura can do, or vice versa. The dark side is that the more privatized and platformized higher education is, the more those materials are not just standardized, but like owned by institutions. I think like the extreme is after reading Tressie McMillan Cottom's, like it's not about literature, but her brilliant book, Lower Ed, in which she studies a bunch of like for-profit universities. I asked her, because it's such meticulous research, and yet she never refers to syllabi or talks much in detail about course content. And I asked her why that was. And she said that it's because it's standard for faculty at all those institutions to have to sign non-disclosure agreements about their own course materials. Like they cannot circulate them, and they won't circulate them, and no one's allowed to circulate them. They're totally owned by the for-profits. So that's one end of the current moment. Like the university devalues teaching as it's connected to professional workers, right? And but it tries to own as much of it as possible. So that's really bad news as for, archives of so many kind of contemporary cultural practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say, we are required by the state of Florida here to submit our syllabi through an institutional repository. But one of the things we did see in our research, and that we've talked to other scholars about, is not making the mistake of imagining that the institutionally submitted version of your syllabus is the one that you are actually using in the classroom. And in part, that is just because of the practical nature of sort of getting with a group of students and figuring out what needs to happen and so on. But, even going back, Rachel and I just did a conversation with Jarvis Gibbons, who has a new book out called Fugitive Pedagogy about K through 12 African-American school teachers. And he really talks about the difference between the institutional records of what was taught, say, at vocational high schools versus what the teachers in practice were actually doing. So I think, so there will be more complete records, I think, of classes, but how we read those records, I think, is a little bit more complicated.
Yeah. But there were some really great projects, like the Open Syllabus Project, like whatever syllabi on the internet do or don't represent, right? Like projects like the Open Syllabus Project at Columbia is really useful to look at the contents of syllabi at that kind of scale. It's just a matter of like how we learn to interpret that data and how, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful. I wanted to actually end with combining 2 questions that were in the chat here. And this is a little bit more about your process. And I should note to Dayton, who is out there somewhere, in the opening pages of the book, there is a little passage on authorship, which is lovely. But I'll let you both talk about that a little bit more. The question is, could you talk a little bit more about how you work as collaborators, and the effect that has on your various projects? And part 2 to that, given the powerful focus on teaching here, how were you able to also bring in your students into your work? And in what ways do students act as collaborators to some regard in these projects?
Yeah. Well, this project began as a course that Laura and I we were teaching the same course, a course called Close Reading and Its Discontents. It was kind of like a history of 20th century literary criticism at the same time at two different institutions. And so partly the experience of teaching that course to two different groups of students that we like brought together across the institutions at some point made us start to wish that we had a better history to assign, like not that we're assigning our own book now, but at the time. And so that course, which is those two courses, which are two of the dedicatees of the book, really was one way that our students influenced the book.
Yeah, Rachel and I both co-authored now scholarship with students, and I don't know if we would have done that with undergraduate students, and I don't know if we would have done that before we did the research for this book and really realized sort of how central students already were to the production of scholarship, that it seemed to then kind of make sense to go the next step. Our collaborative process is that we take a really long time to write a book.
Forever.
Because we really did visit every archive together. We interpreted everything together. We wrote everything together line by line using Google Docs and Skype. And it took more than 10 years. So and we're very aware that, that this kind of scholarship, we're very proud of it. Like, we think it's been kind of stress tested because you bounce things back and forth so much, like there's so much kind of testing of things and editorial functions within the production itself, that we think it turned out really well. But we're also really aware that this is a kind of mode of scholarly production that's like, rare, that's not necessarily available to people depending on their institutions. Like either they're at an institution where they have to produce a single author book for tenure right away, or they're at an institution where they don't have time for research. So we kind of really managed to get lucky with this sweet spot in terms of how we were able to write this book. And it also really did make us kind of look for and become attuned to how much collaboration has been part of the history of the discipline, even as it's, kind of not been valued as such.
Yeah, both just the fact that even though most of them might not work the way we do, like sentence by sentence, like there is a lot of co-authored work of the whole course of the 20th century in literary study. We like pulled the bibliometrics from the MLA database once, just because we were curious, but also because we have kind of, I think people sometimes say relatively parsimonious citation practices in literary studies. So, and that's not necessarily under citation, but we implicitly cite a lot of work that we don't always explicitly cite, and that we have a lot of like sub co-authorship practices of like reading groups or reading other people's works or exchanging work that are often virtually co-authorship, or might in a sciences discipline be counted as co-authorship, that we just don't count as co-authorship because of our institution's focus on solo authored works for humanities scholars. So that's kind of vicious circle in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, having talked to both of you a few times now, the trust and camaraderie and just wonderful relationship that you two have, I guess, of course, across a 10-year history, really comes through. And I just want to thank you both for sharing that with all of us today.
Thanks so much, Kevin.
Thank you. I do want to kind of wrap things up. I know we're about a minute or two over, but I have a fun question that just came in the Q&A, and just a quick response from both of you. We'll see. This could totally fail. That's part of the experiment. Was there ever a heyday in teaching American literature in higher education?
Ooh.
That's not a fun final question.
It's not a fun final question. Neither of us are Americanists, so no one here wants to hear what we think of teaching American literature.
I'll say that I think the 1940s. I will say one more tidbit for the Americanists. The most cited work on American lit syllabi that we were so surprised to find was the autobiography of Lincoln Steffens, which
go read it if you haven't yet.
Everyone is teaching, so somebody go write about that.
Thank you so much for entertaining that. That was a trap in every way, but thank you. With that, I would like to thank Rachel and Laura one more time for joining us today. Thanks to everybody for attending, as always. Our next book talk features Melissa Homestead, who will discuss her recent book, Only the Wonderful Things. Pardon me, did I say that right? The Only Wonderful Things. It's the creative partnership between Willa Cather and Edith Lewis. So that'll be next month. Please remember to check out all of our future AAS programs and to sign up for our mailing list, which is now in the chat. With that, thanks everybody, and I will see you next time.